Hey guys, tonight we slip into a world where the strangest treasures weren't golden coins or glittering jewels, but something that today you'd casually toss into your grocery basket. You wander into an 18th century drawing room, powdered wigs perched, candlelight glowing off gilt mirrors, and there in the middle of the table, one single pineapple. Yes, just one. And every powdered aristocrat is leaning in to gawk at it like it's the crown jewels. You probably won't survive this party because, honestly, you can't eat the star attraction. At least not unless you're willing to part with the price of a carriage, or maybe even a year's rent. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It always fascinates me to see these little slices of the world connecting here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You tread back through time to the late 17th century, when ships creaked across the Atlantic and returned stuffed with exotic curiosities. Brilliant feathers, cacao beans, and, every so often, this odd, spiky fruit. Sailors brought it from the Caribbean, where it had been cultivated for centuries by indigenous peoples who knew it not as a luxury, but as a staple and a symbol of welcome. Europeans, though, saw something different. A fruit that tasted like sunshine trapped in sugar, sweet enough to make your teeth ache, exotic enough to make your status soar. You picture King Charles II having his portrait painted with a pineapple, not because he grew it, he didn't, but because presenting one made you look as if you owned the tropics. The fruit had traveled weeks at sea, surviving storms and rot, wrapped up like a delicate relic. When it reached the table, it was practically a miracle. Historians still argue whether the very first pineapple in England was presented in the 1660s, or if earlier, traders sneaked a few into Iberian ports. But the aura of firstness clung to that royal image. Here's a quirky tidbit. The earliest pineapples displayed in Europe were often already half-spoiled, their sugar eaten away by mold. People still gasped at them, though. Imagine paying for front-row seats to see a celebrity who showed up sick and clapping anyway. That was pineapple fever. You shuffle through the candle-lit rooms of Georgian high society and realize this wasn't just about flavor. It was theater. The pineapple was too rare to eat casually. It became a showpiece, propped up in the center of a banquet, admired, sniffed, sketched, but left intact so it could tour several dinners in a row. Yes, pineapples were passed around like tired party guests. By the end, you could practically smell the exhaustion in their fading sweetness. The pineapple's strangeness wasn't only its taste, but its shape. Jagged, spiny, with a crown that looked like it belonged on a lizard more than a fruit. In an era that adored order, symmetrical gardens, perfect wigs, the pineapple was wildly ornamental. You lean closer to one carved in sugar, another in porcelain, yet none quite matches the thrill of the real, prickly thing. One mainstream fact you pocket here. Pineapples were native to South America, domesticated long before Columbus. Caribbean peoples spread them across islands, cultivating them not just for food, but for fermentation into drinks and for the sheer joy of a sweet bite in a humid climate. Europeans merely stumbled into this long history, then promptly acted like they'd discovered the fruit's very soul. As you let the candlelight dim in your mind, picture the pineapple in its crate, resting after its sea voyage, unaware of the status it has accidentally acquired. It isn't a jewel, it isn't a relic, but in Georgian England it is somehow both. The fruit's arrival shifts from curiosity to obsession. And as you ease deeper into the story, you sense that what begins with a simple exotic snack is about to spiral into a nationwide mania, complete with rivalries, debts, and even architecture shaped like this one tropical fruit. You step out of that crowded Georgian drawing room and into the chilly English countryside, where a new obsession is quietly sprouting. Not in orchards or fields, but in glass and brick contraptions that look more like science experiments than farms. These are the pineries, or pineapple houses, and they're about to suck up more money and more aristocratic pride than some villages see in a decade. You can almost feel the damp air as you wander inside one. The windows are misted with condensation, the air heavy with humidity, and a faint whiff of manure smoke curls past your nose. Yes, smoke, because in a world without central heating, coaxing a tropical fruit to ripen in northern Europe required some truly ridiculous ingenuity. Gardeners shoveled horse dung, coal, and rotting compost into hidden chambers that heated the walls like giant hot water bottles. The pineapples lounged inside, cosseted like royalty, while gardeners tiptoed about, adjusting vents, sprinkling water, and whispering complaints about how much coal the Lord had grudgingly supplied this week. The mainstream historical fact here is simple. By the early 18th century, Britain had mastered the art of forcing pineapples in these greenhouses. It wasn't common, just a handful of great estates could pull it off, but enough that word spread. The fruit could now be grown at home, rather than imported half-rotten across the sea. And so, aristocrats went mad for them, their ambition stoked by each new success. Quirky tidbit: some pineapple houses were so elaborate that they had flues winding behind the walls, channeling smoke in precise patterns to create microclimates. A pineapple might enjoy balmy Caribbean warmth while snow lay outside on the hedges. It's as if the Georgians built tiny time machines, not to leap centuries ahead, but to trick a fruit into believing it had never left the tropics. Historians still argue whether the craze began with genuine horticultural curiosity or simple vanity. Was it about mastering nature, proving that England could tame even the sun itself? Or was it really about throwing the most dazzling dinner party, where guests could swoon over your private hothouse fruit? Probably both, but you can practically hear the self-satisfied coughs of dukes boasting about their gardener's latest triumph. You imagine yourself as one of those gardeners, trudging in before dawn, your boots sinking into mud, stoking the furnace and adjusting damp straw covers. All this for a fruit you will likely never taste yourself. The pineapple wasn't for the staff. It was destined to sit on mahogany tables surrounded by silver cutlery, admired by powdered faces. Your reward? Maybe a nod from the master, or at best, being immortalized in some diary as our gardener who has at last succeeded. These pineapple houses became architectural statements in themselves. Visitors were shown through them as though they were galleries. "Observe the pine," hosts would declare, sweeping open the door with a flourish. Forget paintings, forget statues. This was living art, sweating slightly in the damp air, waiting for admiration. And then there was the constant anxiety. Pineapples took years to mature, sometimes up to 2 or 3. Imagine waiting that long only to have your fruit rot from the inside a week before the big dinner. That's worse than losing a Wi-Fi signal during a streaming binge. Except here, thousands of pounds had been sunk into coal, glass, and dung. You linger in the humid stillness of the pinery, hearing the crackle of fire behind the brick walls, watching the gardeners pace like anxious parents. Outside, the frost bites the fields, but in here, time runs differently, measured not by seasons, but by the slow swelling of a fruit. You sense that this greenhouse obsession is not just a hobby. It is the seed of a cultural fever that will sweep Georgian society, turning pineapples into the crown of prestige and excess. You slip from the hothouse back into the glitter of society, and now the pineapple has fully transformed. Not into food, but into a golden badge of status. You drift into a grand Georgian hall, chandeliers glittering, powdered wigs bobbing, silk skirts sweeping across polished floors. At the center of a banquet table sits a pineapple, and suddenly the entire evening revolves around it. It doesn't matter if there are silver platters of venison or delicate jellies molded into castles. Everyone's gaze is fixed on that single spiky crown. The mainstream historical fact here is that throughout the Georgian era, pineapples were considered luxury goods of almost mythical rarity. Possessing one, even for an evening, marked you as someone of wealth and influence. Owning a greenhouse to grow them. That pushed you into the stratosphere of social prestige. You didn't just have money. You had patience, connections, and the means to make the impossible flourish on English soil. Quirky tidbit. Aristocrats became so enamored with the pineapple as a symbol of power that they began featuring it in their portraits. One famous painting shows Charles II receiving a pineapple from his gardener, as though it were a gift more precious than jewels. Another portrait has a nobleman cradling a pineapple almost like a pet dog, his expression solemn, as though this spiky orb were his greatest achievement. It's the 18th century version of posing with a luxury car on Instagram. Historians still argue whether this symbolism was consciously cultivated. Were the nobles trying to associate themselves with exotic exploration and colonial expansion? Or were they simply riding the wave of a fashionable craze, slapping pineapples on their coats of arms the way people today plaster inspirational quotes on their walls? The truth probably lies somewhere in between, but you can imagine the smirks of neighbors who saw such portraits and muttered, "Yes, very impressive, Jonathan. Your fruit looks nearly ripe." You settle into a seat at the banquet. The pineapple, perched high on a silver stand, glows in the candlelight. Guests lean forward, hands folded, as though in reverence. No one touches it. The fruit is too precious. It's there to be admired, the way you might admire fireworks or a rare comet passing overhead. And you can sense a kind of nervous energy. The host waits for gasps. The guests feel compelled to compliment. No one wants to be the person who shrugs and says, "Hey, it's just a fruit." Behind all this pageantry is a curious blend of awe and insecurity. The pineapple was a way of saying, "Look at me. I have conquered distance. I have bent nature. I have money to burn." But it also carried a subtle anxiety. Because if your pineapple was small, misshapen, or a little too green, people whispered. And in Georgian society, whispers could undo you faster than debts. As you watch, the pineapple almost seems to swell larger, its spines sharper, its crown taller until it dominates the room. The venison cools, the wine warms, but no one notices. They are still transfixed by this tropical invader that has somehow become the ultimate symbol of power. The party drifts onward, and you notice something peculiar. No one has actually eaten the fruit yet. The pineapple just sits there, preening under the candlelight like a smug guest who knows everyone is talking about them. Eventually, you realize that in many Georgian banquets, the pineapple's greatest purpose wasn't to be consumed at all. It was to be admired. The mainstream fact here is that Georgian hosts frequently displayed pineapples at the center of their dining tables, parading them as the crown jewel of a feast. The fruit might sit in a silver stand or on a porcelain platter, sometimes even supported by decorative greenery to accentuate its tropical origins. Only rarely was it sliced and served. Why waste years of cultivation or the cost of a small fortune on something that would vanish in 3 bites? Instead, the pineapple was reused, carried from dinner to dinner, until it grew soft and sad, its crown wilting like a weary performer at the end of a long tour. The quirky tidbit: if the pineapple began to rot before its social duty was finished, some hosts replaced the inside with a carved turnip or apple mash, carefully reassembling the rind so no guest would notice. That way, the fruit could keep up appearances, even if its glory was only skin deep. You can almost hear the whispering servants. "Don't breathe too close, sir. It's gone a bit aromatic." Historians still argue whether guests truly believed they would ever get a taste. Some accounts describe pineapples being ceremonially cut at the end of the evening, while others suggest they were whisked away uneaten, preserved for the next occasion. The line between myth and memory blurs. But you suspect most guests knew they were unlikely to sink their teeth into that golden flesh. It was like being invited to admire a priceless painting. You wouldn't expect to pocket it on your way out. Imagine yourself at that long mahogany table, the smell of roast goose wafting past, and yet your eyes keep drifting back to the pineapple, glowing under a cluster of wax-dripped candles. You lean toward your neighbor and murmur, "Exquisite, isn't it?" even though you have no idea what it tastes like. It's peer pressure at its most refined. One satirical poet of the age joked that pineapples were more looked at than tasted, more worshipped than consumed. And indeed, the pineapple's role was halfway between dessert and deity. Guests admired it, hosts boasted of it, and the fruit itself quietly wilted. Dreaming perhaps of simpler days in Caribbean sunshine. The whole spectacle feels oddly familiar. You've seen the same pattern when someone buys a ridiculously expensive gadget and then spends the whole evening showing it off rather than using it. The pineapple was the Georgian iPhone launch. Shiny, scarce, and designed to make you feel a little left behind if you didn't have one. By the end of the evening, the pineapple is carefully lifted from its pedestal, wrapped gently in cloth, and spirited away to rest before the next party. It is both treasure and prisoner, the unwilling centerpiece of endless banquets. And as you watch it disappear into the shadows, you realize the story of the pineapple is only beginning. The banquet halls grow quiet, and you follow the pineapple as it leaves the candlelight behind. Outside the grand houses, something peculiar is happening. Pineapples are being rented. Yes, in Georgian England, you didn't have to own one. You could simply borrow the prestige for the evening. The mainstream fact here is that a thriving trade developed around pineapple rental. Wealthy hosts who didn't want the headache or the astronomical cost of growing their own could hire a fruit from a specialist gardener or merchant. The pineapple would be delivered in a little protective case, displayed proudly at dinner, and then returned, sometimes slightly worse for wear. It was a business model somewhere between a tuxedo hire and a library book. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some pineapples made the rounds at half a dozen parties. So well-traveled that one contemporary joked they should be issued passports. Imagine the fruit, weary and bruised, staring blankly at yet another room of gawping guests, silently thinking, "Not this again." It was the Georgian equivalent of a celebrity on a never-ending press tour. Historians still argue whether guests knew the pineapples were recycled or if hosts tried to pass them off as freshly acquired treasures. Some diaries hint at a sly awareness. Remarks about our host's familiar fruit suggest people occasionally spotted a repeat performer. But others describe astonishment, as though each pineapple were unique. Perhaps politeness dictated that no one spoil the illusion. You picture yourself as one of those hired pineapples, carried by carriage over rutted roads, jostled in wicker baskets, and set on yet another gleaming table. Each night, new faces lean close, sniffing, nodding, murmuring compliments. You can almost hear the fruit groaning softly. "Please, just let me retire in peace." The whole system reveals just how performative the craze had become. It wasn't really about the fruit itself. It was about the aura of wealth it projected. To rent a pineapple was to rent applause, to borrow status for the night. And you can imagine a cash-strapped squire fidgeting nervously as the bill arrived, knowing he had just paid more for one evening's decoration than for his stable boy's wages. At the end of the evening, the pineapple would be wrapped back up and sent home with the gardener, sometimes accompanied by strict instructions not to nibble it on the way. Its value lay not in taste, but in visibility, in the whispered admiration it inspired as it sat untouched. Regal as any monarch. As you drift further into this story, the pineapple becomes less a fruit and more a traveling actor, performing its role again and again until the curtain finally fell. And in that strange theatrical economy, you realize Georgian society had perfected the art of showing off with something that was, at heart, destined to rot. You leave the weary, rented pineapple resting in its basket and step into the accounting rooms of Georgian estates, where another drama unfolds. Not on stage, but in ledgers inked with endless columns of numbers. Growing pineapples at home wasn't just eccentric, it was ruinously expensive. The mainstream historical fact here is that a single pineapple could cost the equivalent of thousands of modern pounds when grown in England. Constructing a proper pinery demanded glass, brick, fuel, and a team of skilled gardeners. Maintaining it meant constant coal deliveries, endless labor, and a stream of small disasters, rot, frost, or fungus, that could erase years of effort. To keep up appearances, landlords sometimes poured more into their pineapple houses than into the upkeep of tenant cottages. Quirky tidbit. A nobleman once recorded with great pride the moment his pineapple ripened, only to note gloomily that the heating flues had consumed so much coal that his servants shivered all winter. It was a literal case of burning warmth for pineapples while leaving people in the cold. Imagine telling your staff, "Sorry about the frostbite, but the fruit looks spectacular." Historians still argue whether these outlays were sensible investments in social standing or reckless vanity projects. Some estates advertised their success, attracting paying visitors eager to glimpse the exotic fruit, almost like a miniature theme park. Others quietly bled money, propping up pineries as though keeping an eccentric relative hidden from the neighbors. You lean over the shoulder of a Georgian accountant, his quill scratching away, tallying figures that spiral ever higher: bricks, manure, glazing, coal, labor, replacement glass after storms, yet more coal. The sums boggle the mind. The noble beside him mutters, "But it will all be worth it," when Lady Pembroke faints at the sight. You can't help but think it's the world's most expensive fainting trick. Meanwhile, in towns and villages, pamphlets spread tales of these bizarre expenditures. Satirists mocked aristocrats for bankrupting themselves in pursuit of a fruit, and ballads joked about poor tenants whose roofs leaked while their landlord's pineapples basked under perfect glass. The pineapple became a kind of moral cartoon, proof that the rich would spend anything to look impressive. And yet, despite the grumbling, the mania continued. Because in Georgian society, not having a pineapple to show off felt worse than losing a fortune. Pride mattered more than solvency, and the pineapple was pride made flesh, or rather, made spines. You step back from the ledger, hearing the coal crackle faintly in the furnaces of the distant pinery. The numbers blur, the ink smudges, and all you can see is a fruit glowing faintly in the candlelight. Its cost hidden in the shadows, but its aura dazzling enough to keep the aristocrats hooked. You leave the smoky ledgers behind and drift into a gallery where the air smells faintly of oil paint and varnish. Here, the pineapple takes on a new life, not as a fruit on a table, but as an icon on canvas. Georgian society adored immortalizing its treasures, and what better way to prove your wealth than to be painted with the rarest fruit in Europe? The mainstream historical fact here is that pineapples appear again and again in 18th century art. They sit on platters in still-life paintings, their jagged crowns poking proudly among grapes and peaches. They glow in portraits, tucked under arms, or presented ceremoniously by gardeners. They even show up in murals, sculptures, and decorative plasterwork, all part of the visual language of prestige. Quirky tidbit: one painting of Charles II shows him being offered a pineapple by John Rose, his gardener. But if you squint at the canvas, you notice the king looks mildly unimpressed, as though someone had just handed him a slightly spiky hedgehog. Art historians still chuckle about that strained expression, wondering whether the king had ever actually tasted one, or if he was simply doing his duty, pretending enthusiasm for the most fashionable prop of the moment. Historians still argue whether these images reflected genuine pride in horticultural achievement or whether they were simply staged, as symbolic as crowns or scepters. Was the pineapple meant to showcase Britain's colonial reach, suggesting dominion over tropical lands? Or was it just the Georgian equivalent of commissioning a portrait with your new racehorse, your prized silverware, or your particularly photogenic spaniel? As you wander the gallery, you notice that in still life after still life, the pineapple gleams unnaturally golden, often bigger and more perfect than real ones ever grew in those fragile greenhouses. Painters exaggerated, of course. They always do. But in doing so, they turned the pineapple into something almost mythical, a fruit that belonged as much to imagination as to reality. You pause before one particularly lavish painting, a table spread with Venetian glass, a silver jug, and towering at the center, a pineapple so luminous it could be mistaken for a sun. Around it, peaches and plums slump in the shadows, as though embarrassed. The pineapple hogs the spotlight, immortalized forever as the diva of the fruit bowl. It strikes you that this was a clever solution for the pineapple's fragility. Unlike the rented fruits that rotted after a season, a painted pineapple could last for centuries, hanging in a drawing room to dazzle guests long after the real thing had withered. A pineapple on canvas was eternal bragging rights. As you let your eyes rest on those gilded frames, you realize the fruit has leapt from greenhouse to gallery, from banquet to brushstroke. Its spiky silhouette isn't just admired in the moment. It is preserved, idealized and repeated, until the pineapple becomes less about flavor and more about symbol. Endlessly reproduced in oil and ink for generations to sigh over. You step out of the painted gallery and into the earthy, humid warmth of a pinery once again. But this time, you're not here to admire the fruit. You're here to meet the people behind it. Because for every nobleman who bragged about a pineapple, there was an army of gardeners sweating in silence, coaxing these tropical divas into existence. The mainstream historical fact here is that specialized gardeners became essential to the pineapple craze. These men, and occasionally women, were not ordinary groundskeepers. They were highly skilled horticulturalists, adept at controlling heat, humidity, and soil conditions with meticulous precision. A successful gardener could make or break a household's reputation, and some became almost as famous as their employers. Quirky tidbit. Gardeners guarded their pineapple-growing secrets like state intelligence. Some allegedly worked at night so rivals couldn't peek into their techniques. One story claims a gardener smeared pig's blood on his pineapples, convinced it strengthened their crowns. Whether it worked or not is debatable, but it certainly discouraged nosy neighbors from touching the plants. Historians still argue whether these gardeners were fairly rewarded for their genius or exploited as invisible labor. Some received generous salaries, cottages, and lifelong positions if they succeeded. Others faced dismissal if a single crop failed. One unlucky gardener was said to have been fired after a prized pineapple collapsed into mush just before a banquet. His reputation spoiled along with the fruit. You wander through the greenhouse, watching a gardener gently brush dust from the pineapple leaves, whispering encouragement as though speaking to a child. He knows the soil's exact dampness by touch. The heat of the brick flues by the back of his hand. His boots crunch softly on gravel. His brow drips with sweat, and he carries the weight of expectation heavier than any spade. Because for his employer, this fruit is more than a delicacy. It's social ammunition. Imagine the pressure. 2 or 3 years of nurturing, only for frost to sneak in one bitter night, or mold to bloom unseen. One mistake, one forgotten vent, and the dream collapses. And yet, gardeners persevered, their names whispered in horticultural circles, their skills admired but rarely celebrated in public. You can almost feel the quiet pride radiating from them when a pineapple finally swells golden, ready for its debut. For the aristocrat, it is triumph. For the gardener, it is vindication, proof that they too have mastered a little corner of the impossible. As you drift further through the glasshouse, the scent of damp earth rises around you, and the crackle of hidden furnaces hums like a heartbeat. The gardeners keep moving, shadows among the leaves, unsung heroes of a mania that belonged to their masters but was built by their hands. You leave the gardeners behind, wiping sweat from your brow, and wander into the drawing rooms again. This time not for admiration, but for rivalry. Because pineapples didn't just sit quietly on tables, they strutted into Georgian society as weapons of competition. Families measured their prestige by the size, sweetness, and sheer audacity of their fruit. The mainstream historical fact here is that aristocratic households frequently competed over who could produce the finest pineapple. Letters and diaries from the period mention lords boasting of fruit of uncommon magnitude, or a specimen surpassing all rivals. Owning a greenhouse wasn't enough. You had to have the biggest, brightest, or earliest ripening pineapple in the county. It was agricultural one-upmanship disguised as hospitality. Quirky tidbit. One estate reportedly hosted a pineapple duel, where two noblemen presented their fruits side by side at a dinner, leaving guests to murmur judgments as though it were a dog show. The evening ended not in a duel of pistols, but in passive-aggressive compliments about which pineapple looked more regal. You can imagine the sulky silence of the loser, glaring at his slightly stunted specimen. Historians still argue whether these rivalries genuinely advanced horticulture or merely inflated egos. Did the constant competition push gardeners to refine techniques that improved heating systems, soil blends, and ventilation? Or was it simply wasted innovation, all devoted to coaxing one tropical fruit to ripen in damp English air? The debate continues, but it's safe to say pride was a powerful motivator. You stroll into a country house where two neighbors, invited for supper, exchange the kind of brittle politeness only true rivals manage. One clears his throat and casually mentions his gardener has a pineapple nearly the size of a baby's head. The other counters with a sly smile, insisting his fruit smells sweeter than honeycomb. It's small talk, laced with daggers, and all over something you'd now buy for a few coins at a supermarket. Sometimes the rivalry even spilled into print. Local newspapers occasionally reported on remarkable pineapples, celebrating their girth or unusual ripening dates. To see your fruit in print was to win bragging rights for the season. And when the neighbors read it over breakfast, you can imagine the scowls. You sink into a velvet armchair, sipping warm claret, listening to these genteel squabbles unfold. On the surface, it's just fruit, but beneath, it's the eternal human game of status. Who has more, who has better, who can make others feel a twinge of envy. And so the pineapple became not only a symbol of wealth, but also a trophy of rivalry. Spiky in more ways than one, the rivalries ripple outward, and soon the pineapple isn't just a tool for impressing neighbors. It's drafted into the delicate art of diplomacy. You drift into a gilded chamber where ambassadors shuffle papers, courtiers whisper behind lace cuffs, and in the middle of it all, someone clears their throat and presents a pineapple. The mainstream historical fact here is that pineapples became fashionable diplomatic gifts in the 18th century. Monarchs, envoys, and politicians offered them to one another as symbols of prosperity, refinement, and exotic reach. To hand someone a pineapple was to say, "Look how far my influence extends. Look what wonders I can summon from distant lands." Quirky tidbit. In one famous case, Catherine the Great of Russia reportedly delighted in receiving pineapples from foreign visitors, though some sources hint she preferred them candied rather than fresh. Imagine traveling across Europe with a carefully wrapped fruit in your carriage, terrified that it might bruise before reaching her table. Your Majesty, here is a slightly dented token of our alliance. Historians still argue whether these gestures carried genuine political weight or were simply ornamental flourishes. Did the pineapple actually sway treaties, or was it just the 18th century equivalent of sending fancy chocolates and hoping for goodwill? Either way, the fruit often traveled in the company of letters, jewels, and silks, wrapped into the grand theater of international relations. Picture yourself in a drafty palace chamber in Vienna. An envoy bows, presenting a pineapple to a noblewoman who accepts it with exaggerated reverence, as though holding a newborn child. Around the room, courtiers nod approvingly, whispering about the giver's sophistication. The fruit may not survive the week, but for that brief moment, it glows brighter than gold. The comedy of it all is hard to miss. Imagine a treaty hanging in the balance, ambassadors sweating over terms, and then someone slides a pineapple across the table like a peace offering. Yes, yes, we'll sign. Look at those spines. You can't help but chuckle at the image of world politics tipping on the wobble of a tropical fruit. And yet, these gifts mattered because symbolism mattered. The pineapple carried whispers of colonies, trade routes, and the mastery of distant climates. To present one was to parade your global connections, even if, behind the scenes, your gardeners were freezing and your tenants were grumbling about rent. As you drift out of the chamber, you sense how far the pineapple's shadow stretched, not only into drawing rooms and rivalries, but into the very stage of diplomacy, where empires nodded gravely over the most spiky handshake in history. You slip away from the drafty palace chamber and into the kitchens, where the pineapple's fate sometimes took a stranger turn. After all, while most fruits were endlessly displayed, a few did make it into recipes, though not always in ways you'd call appetizing. The mainstream historical fact here is that Georgian cooks experimented with pineapples in a range of dishes. They were sliced into jellies, preserved in sugar, or even simmered into sauces for meat. Some ambitious chefs brewed pineapple wine, hoping to bottle the tropical sun. And, though rare, the very richest households occasionally roasted slices alongside other fruits in pies. Quirky tidbit. One recipe from the era suggested boiling pineapples with sugar and brandy to create a syrupy cordial. But contemporary complaints note the result tasted faintly of leather steeped in vinegar. Hardly the luxurious nectar guests had been promised. You can imagine polite diners nodding earnestly, while secretly longing for a normal apple tart. Historians still argue whether anyone in England at the time truly knew what a fresh, ripe pineapple should taste like. Imported ones were usually half-spoiled, and the greenhouse varieties, though impressive, sometimes lacked the rich sweetness of Caribbean fruits. So, when aristocrats praised pineapple confections, were they genuinely thrilled, or just pretending to enjoy the fashionable flavor of the hour? Scholars remain divided. You watch as a cook carefully peels the spiny skin, hands nicked from its sharp edges, and slices the pale flesh. The kitchen is noisy with clattering pans, steam rising, dogs underfoot. She ladles the fruit into a mold, sets it in cool water to set, and later the jiggling jelly emerges at table, shimmering like amber, admired more for its wobble than its flavor. Pineapple wine, too, had its heyday. Some bottles were sold in London shops for exorbitant prices, promising exotic pleasure. But accounts suggest the taste often fell short, more acidic than alluring, and sometimes dangerously fizzy, as though the bottles themselves disapproved of being opened. You can almost hear one cork exploding in protest during a dinner, sending guests leaping in alarm. And yet, despite the dubious results, people persevered. The pineapple wasn't about taste so much as novelty. To sip pineapple cordial, even if it puckered your mouth, was to sip prestige. To serve pineapple tarts, no matter how chewy, was to declare your house a step ahead of fashion. As you stand in that smoky Georgian kitchen, watching another batch of pineapple preserve being poured into jars, you realize the fruit's culinary role was as much performance as its presence on a banquet table. It wasn't just food, it was theater, sugar-drenched and faintly absurd. You leave the sticky jars of preserves behind and wander outside, into the crisp air of Georgian gardens. Here, the pineapple escapes the plate entirely, and sprouts instead across architecture. yes, it wasn't enough to grow or eat the fruit. People began building with it, stamping its spiky silhouette into stone, iron, and wood, as though the very shape could bestow prestige. The mainstream historical fact here is that pineapples became one of the most popular decorative motifs of the 18th century in Britain. They appeared as carved finials on gate posts, etched into silverware, embroidered on upholstery, and even crowning the tops of grand houses. Their spiky form was instantly recognizable, and their association with hospitality and wealth made them a perfect symbol to plaster everywhere you wanted guests to be impressed. Quirky tidbit. The most famous example still stands in Scotland, the Dunmore pineapple, a garden folly built in 1761 with a 37-foot-tall stone pineapple crowning its roof. It's so extravagantly odd that visitors often think it must be a modern joke, but no, it is very real, looming proudly like the world's grandest fruit salad garnish. The builder, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, apparently decided his garden pavilion needed a little something extra. And by little, he meant a massive stone fruit sprouting above the trees. Historians still argue whether such pineapple architecture carried deep symbolic meaning or was simply whimsical fashion. Was the Earl making a grand statement about imperial reach and exotic abundance? Or was he just having a laugh, deciding his estate needed a conversation piece to baffle future generations? No consensus exists, though the latter theory feels deliciously plausible. As you stroll along Georgian streets, you see pineapples crowning iron gates, welcoming visitors with spiky grandeur. They appear on bedposts, assuring guests they are sleeping in the lap of fashionable hospitality. You even notice them carved into church pews, where their meaning shifts awkwardly. Was it exotic abundance, or just a parishioner trying to keep up with trends? Imagine being a stonemason tasked with chiseling pineapples day after day, never having tasted one, and perhaps never even seeing one in real life. You'd rely on sketches, rumors, or your own imagination. Some carvings end up looking oddly like artichokes, others like pine cones. But no matter, they still carried the aura of wealth. You tilt your head back to gaze at the great Dunmore pineapple, its spines sharp against the gray sky, its crown of stone leaves frozen in perpetual summer. It's absurd, magnificent, and a little bit endearing, proof that the pineapple's reign extended far beyond greenhouses and banquet tables into the very bones of Georgian architecture. And so, as you wander beneath its shadow, you realize the fruit has rooted itself not just in stomachs or sketchbooks, but in stone and mortar, declaring itself an eternal guest at the Georgian table of vanity. You step away from the towering Dunmore pineapple and wander back into the hum of Georgian cities, where the pineapple's fame had begun to spill onto pamphlets, newspapers, and gossip-filled taverns. When anything becomes too fashionable, it eventually becomes a target. And the pineapple was ripe for mockery. The mainstream historical fact here is that satirists of the 18th century poked relentless fun at pineapple mania. Caricatures in London prints showed absurdly overdressed aristocrats bowing to fruit, while pamphlets lampooned the enormous costs of maintaining pineries. For ordinary people who could never hope to taste the fruit, laughter became a way to puncture the pretensions of the wealthy. Quirky tidbit. One play staged in Bath included a running joke about a nobleman who lost his fortune trying to keep a pineapple alive through winter, only for it to collapse into a puddle of mush on stage. Audiences roared with laughter, not because they disliked the fruit, but because everyone knew someone in real life who had tried something just as foolish. Historians still argue whether this satire helped hasten the decline of pineapple mania, or merely reflected the public's growing irritation with aristocratic excess. Was the fruit's reputation undone by sharp pens or by shifting economics? It's impossible to pin down, though the flood of cartoons suggests the pineapple had firmly crossed from awe into cliché. You picture yourself walking through a London print shop, copper engravings stacked high, the smell of ink in the air. On one sheet, a pineapple struts with human legs, mocked as the king of fools. On another, a landlord clutches his beloved fruit while tenants shiver in rags. The humor is biting but also oddly affectionate, an acknowledgement that the pineapple was both ridiculous and irresistible. At taverns, too, the jokes multiplied. Patrons raised mugs of ale and teased each other. "Careful, don't spill. It cost as much as a pineapple." The fruit had become shorthand for extravagance, as familiar in comedy as in portraits, and every laugh chipped away at its aura of unapproachable grandeur. Imagine the frustration of an aristocrat, proudly unveiling a pineapple at dinner, only for a guest to smirk and quote the latest cartoon. "Oh, splendid! I see you've brought along your spiky landlord again." Prestige cracked under the weight of ridicule, and though the fruit remained rare, it no longer carried quite the same mystique. As you drift out of the noisy tavern, the echoes of laughter linger. The pineapple is still admired, but it has been humbled, reduced from sacred emblem to punchline. Still spiky, still costly, but now tangled up in scandal, satire, and sly Georgian humor. You drift onward from the noisy taverns into quieter streets, where the pineapple's glow begins to fade. What once dazzled as the crown of Georgian society slowly loses its shine, overtaken by changing tastes, shifting economies, and the simple fact that novelty never lasts forever. The mainstream historical fact here is that by the early 19th century, imported pineapples became more accessible thanks to faster ships and expanding colonial trade networks. Sugar plantations churned out preserved fruits, and pineapples, once the impossible prize of a greenhouse, could be purchased, at least in port cities, for a fraction of their former price. The fruit's exclusivity crumbled, and with it, the mania. Quirky tidbit: one London fruit seller advertised pineapples by the dozen, stacked in a pyramid in his shop window, to the astonishment of passers-by. What once required years of tending and a fortune in coal could now be bought with a few shillings. Children pressed their noses against the glass, giggling at the sight of so many crowns spiking upward like a miniature forest. Historians still argue whether the decline was primarily economic or cultural. Did pineapples simply become too common to impress? Or did satire and scandal tarnish their reputation beyond repair? Some suggest that the rise of other luxury goods, tea, coffee, chocolate, distracted attention. Others believe the pineapple had always been destined to burn bright and fade fast, its aura dependent on scarcity. You stroll through a once grand estate, its greenhouse dusty, the furnaces cold. Weeds creep into the abandoned flues. Glass panes sag with cracks. The pineapple house that once devoured coal and wages now stands as a monument to fashion's fickleness. A gardener passes by with a shrug, muttering that the master no longer bothers. Too costly, too outdated, too mocked. Meanwhile, urban households begin serving pineapple jam and tinned slices, shipped in bulk from the Caribbean. the fruit slides from aristocratic pedestal to everyday pantry, its exotic sheen replaced by sticky convenience. What was once rented out like crown jewels now comes stacked in syrupy jars, waiting to be spooned onto toast. You can almost hear the pineapple sigh with relief. No longer forced to parade endlessly across banquet tables or pose stiffly in portraits, it finally returns to being what it always was, a fruit, sweet and spiky, best enjoyed in quiet bites rather than in grand ceremonies. And so, the Georgian craze flickers out, leaving behind empty pineries, mocking prints, and a strange legacy of stone pineapples crowning gates. The fruit's reign has ended, but its story isn't finished. Not yet. You wander into the twilight of the pineapple's long Georgian career, where its glory has dimmed, but its echoes linger everywhere. Though no longer the crown jewel of banquets or the ruinous obsession of landowners, the pineapple endures, woven into culture and design in ways both obvious and subtle. The mainstream historical fact here is that the pineapple settled into Western symbolism as an emblem of hospitality. Inns and taverns hung carved pineapples on their signs. Gate posts sported them as welcoming finials. And in America, the motif traveled with colonists, eventually becoming shorthand for warmth and welcome. To this day, you can find pineapples carved into bedposts, stitched into quilts, or perched atop porch railings. Quirky tidbit: in the 19th century, pineapple-shaped jellies became a staple at middle-class dinner tables, molded from gelatin and decorated with green-tinted sugar leaves. These wobbly imitations allowed hosts to borrow the fruit's prestige even when no fresh pineapples were in sight. Guests would laugh gently at the artifice, but still admire the effort. Historians still argue whether the pineapple's endurance as a symbol stems from its Georgian mania, or from its deeper association with Caribbean traditions of welcome. Was it purely aristocratic fashion that cemented its meaning, or did its indigenous symbolism seep quietly into European minds through centuries of contact? Scholars debate, but the pineapple's dual identity, both colonial trophy and emblem of hospitality, remains unresolved. You picture yourself strolling through a modern hotel lobby, where a brass pineapple lamp glows softly on a side table. Guests pass by without a second thought, unaware that this harmless trinket carries the weight of centuries of obsession, satire, and prestige. The fruit has been tamed, democratized, reduced to decor. Yet if you pause long enough, you can almost hear the echoes of candlelit banquets, the hiss of coal in pinery flues, the whispered envy of rival aristocrats. And so, the pineapple survives not as an object of ridicule or ruin, but as a symbol that still makes people smile. It no longer bankrupts landlords or headlines satirical pamphlets. It simply sits quietly in wallpaper patterns, welcome mats, and souvenirs, a reminder that even the most absurd fashions can leave behind sweet traces. Now, as the story eases into silence, you let the spiky crown fade from view. The frenzy is over, the fruit is safe, and the world drifts onward, carrying the pineapple into calmer waters of memory and design. And now, as the lights dim even further, let the pineapple slip gently out of focus. You've walked through its entire strange journey, from a fruit carried across oceans, to a treasure guarded in hot brick greenhouses, to a tired guest rented out again and again. You've stood in smoky kitchens, among dripping gardeners, and beneath stone pineapples carved absurdly high into the sky. And now it all softens, as though you're placing the fruit back down on a quiet shelf where it can finally rest. The noise of Georgian banquets fades away, their chandeliers flickering out one by one. The laughter of taverns, the whispers of rivals, the scratching quills of accountants, all dissolve into silence. Even the spiky silhouette of the pineapple itself grows blurred, no longer sharp or glittering, but softened into a round, hazy glow. You feel your breath slowing to match its rhythm, steady and easy. There is no more rivalry here, no pressure, no endless cost to count. Just the memory of a fruit that once dazzled, now drifting gently into calm. The greenhouses are quiet, the fires extinguished, the gardeners finally at rest. Even the stone pineapple of Dunmore stands peacefully under the night sky, its spines bathed in moonlight. No longer a joke, just a curious ornament waiting for dawn. Let yourself rest the way those pineries do now. Empty, still, but full of lingering warmth. Imagine closing the heavy greenhouse door, hearing it click softly shut, and walking away under the stars. The story has ended, the fruit is safe, and so are you. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the pineapple's strange, spiky crown fade into the softest of dreams.